Okay, so ask me anything. What questions do you have about the games industry, game development, level design, game audio, my career, anything at all? And even just and if you don't have questions right away, I am going to start spinning industry yarns I have so that we don't have lots of dead, awkward silence. But does anyone have any questions for me about anything? Yeah, Michael, we'll start with you.
So I've been told that getting into the game industry as a designer, ideas man, is very difficult to next to impossible. So what would you suggest would be the ideal area to try to get into the games industry so that I can transition into design, like art or level design or what?
Okay, and I'll repeat all these just in case because I know that the voices are going to be pretty soft. Let me just make sure my mic level is nice and hot too. So the question was, how can I get in the games industry as a designer when the ideas, sort of the whole notion of I'm the ideas person is kind of difficult, right? It's actually kind of scorned. We did an episode on this. Actually, we did one called. I forget what it was called, but it was basically me kind of... I don't like how negative we've gotten. I mean, I'll answer your question, but just as an aside, I don't like how negative we've gotten about the ideas person, ideas man, however you want to call it. Only because ideas are... I remember the name of the episode now. It's Are Ideas Cheap, right? Because that's what people say. They'll say ideas are cheap. Implementation is what matters, and I agree with that, but I think we've gotten so focused on that ideas do matter. Everything starts as ideas, so I kind of rebel a little bit against that. But to get to your question, the very practical question that you had, so what you have to do as a designer is you have to marry your design sort of passion with some hard skills that can enable you to get in. And why level design is such a good path for that is, okay, what are the hard skills you're going to bring to the table as a level designer? Okay, you will be able to use level editors well. Okay, that's a skill. Believe it or not, that seems almost trivial, especially because everyone here sitting in this classroom has been using game editors for at least, some of you it's your first time, but you've been using them since late August when we started, and it's November. Others in this class have had years of experience with Unreal at this point, and possible Unity and so on. But that is actually a skill, being able, if I take like a random good solid computer user, but they're just not familiar with the tech, and I set the tech in front of them, they wouldn't know what to do, right? So that's one hard skill, right, that level design says that you have. And then the other kind of hard skills that you have are documentations. Why have you do design documents for everything, right? That you could make good, clean documentation that's sensible, that's grammatical, that's professional and polished. That's another kind of hard skill in the designer kind of package. Okay, then we have the level design sort of specific skills that are things like, okay, I have mastery of level layout, like how to use level layout to influence gameplay, or I can use scripting, kind of light programming to influence gameplay. Those are hard skills, actually, right? So, what's nice about level design is you kind of have this wide collection, and there might be some art skills too, kind of environment art knowledge. You might be able to go into 3D Studio Max or Maya and make simple things in order to accomplish your blockouts. Even the blockout itself, doing a blockout is a hard skill, right? So the nice thing about level design, I find, is that none of these skills by themselves are particularly mind-blowing, right? Being able to open up Unreal and just make some stuff is not going to, by itself, blow anyone's mind, right? Being able to make a good, clean design document is not going to blow anyone's mind by itself. But when you combine them all together, now you have someone that, that doesn't exist everywhere. That is a niche thing that makes you valuable, right? So you have to have this. I guess the difference between like level design and why it's so useful for someone like yourself, Michael, is that what you do to get in as an artist is you pick kind of your art focus and you try to do that really, really well, right? If you're going to be a concept artist, you better, draw good, right? So to speak. So you're kind of picking one thing, basically, and getting that 10,000 hours of mastery in. With level design, it's like, okay, you are taking a bunch of things, right? Learning them all, reasonably well, but nothing, it's not like you're spending 10,000 hours only. Well, you probably will by the time you get through a 4-year program like this, but it's not like it's an extreme level of mastery in the software, in the documentation, in the level layout, programming, the kind of art things you'll touch. It's instead of like one thing that you drill down into, it's many different things that you combine into one package, and that is how you get your foot in the door, as a designer in the industry. Because then you're not just an ideas man at that point, right? You have all these things that you can do, and I find that it's what ends up happening, and what puts you in the position you're in maybe is that it's frustrating if you're sitting at an art school, which is not what Purdue is, obviously, but if you were somewhere like, I don't know, Columbia College or whoever else that really focuses on art, if you want to be a designer, it's frustrating to draw 1,000 faces. I remember this. I remember trying to do this at Southern Methodist because it was suggested if I was interested in art, I should just draw face after face after face after face, find an ideal kind of human face and just draw it 1,000,000 times. And I'm like, I wanted to make games. I didn't want to draw a face 1,000,000 times, right? That's when you have a designer's mentality, right? Because a level designer is someone who wants to learn all the things that are necessary to make the games, but not necessarily to master those individual pieces. But a concept artist will want to do that, right? Because they may like games, and a concept artist may appreciate the fact that they can, that video games exist, that gives them this opportunity to kind of flex their skill set, but ultimately they are about that skill set. So that's kind of how you can not be the ideas person, build up all these variety of skills. Now, as you progress, this is a really long answer, I know, but it's an interesting topic, right, that I've thought a lot about. As you progress in your career, you're going to have the opportunity to do more ideas things, right? Like you'll end up kind of graduating into positions where more and more of your creativity will be, utilized potentially. But there's another point of wisdom here. This class is going to challenge my voice, I can already tell. So one thing that you should understand with industry work is that while you'll be given a fair amount of creativity within your realm, when you work for the big companies, or if you work in industry proper as opposed to being indie, you're always going to be working on someone else's game, right? And so it's very rare that you're going to be put in a position where you're on a project that the project came from you, right? That's when you become indie, or a lot of times, and you see this all the time. I mean, when I worked at Irrational Games, it's amazing how many of those people ended up making games with their own companies after that company went away, right? Like that game was just loaded, or that company was loaded with immense talent. So what do you see now? You see, the Molasses Flood, who made Flame in the Flood some years ago as an independent game. And actually, we interviewed on the podcast the art director of that company, Gwen Frey, who then made her own company to make her own game, right? That's done very well. And then you look at there is a game, there's kind of like a vampire comedy game that just got through Kickstarter that was another ex-Irrational person, and they did games for this. So yeah, people do that. They'll go in the industry, they'll spend 5 or 10 years there, and then they'll make a go of it on their own because that's the only way they can really do what they want. There's another colleague of mine that I worked with at Human Head, Mark Soskin, who went and worked for Human Head, then worked for a few other companies, including Obsidian, on the Outer Worlds even. And now he kickstarted his own project, again, because he wants to do his own stuff. So that's kind of the path, right? Get in as a level designer of some kind, And maybe you're totally happy with that for the rest of your career, but like sort of if you want to do your own thing, you sort of have to branch out eventually. Okay, wow, that was an epic answer to that question. Hopefully you've thought of other... I know, Keith, you had a question. Do you still remember it?
I was going to ask, mine's a very simple question, kind of compared to the one we just answered, but how many games have you worked on, and what were they?
All right, yeah, so let's go through this. So when we go all the way back to the year 2006, I worked on a unreleased RPG called The Broken Hourglass. I actually did all the audio for it, right? And we're in-game audio class now. So, and that was kind of... did you have a
Sounds really familiar.
Yeah, you may have heard of it if you were into the... back in those days, there was a pretty healthy scene for Baldur's Gate mods. And things like that, where they would add different characters to the game, third-party groups like mod groups, volunteer groups, and that's kind of how I got to know these people. And because I did some, I was trying to break into the industry, and I did some, free work on some mods there, and I eventually got to know a fellow named Jason Compton who was trying to spin up. The idea was, okay, we have all these people that are modding Baldur's Gate. Why don't we make a new Baldur's Gate, basically, or a game like that? And it was kind of ahead of its time, right? Because when you think about things like Pillars of Eternity and things like that, these Baldur's Gate influenced games that have come out in the last 5 or 6 years, these were massive Kickstarter success stories because there was a pent-up demand. But this was before Kickstarter. There was no means for these people to raise money, so they self-financed development of this Baldur's Gate influenced kind of isometric sort of early BioWare style RPG, and they hired me to do the music and sound for it. It was my first paying gig ever, but it just ended up not working out because it was really hard to self-finance. It was also my first GDC. I went to like a publisher party with them. That was cool. And that's kind of what spurred me on to go to SMU Guildhall to get better educated, because I kind of got my taste. And after that experience, I worked for Vicious Cycle Software. Despicable Me, the game, was my first published title. That was the Nintendo Wii, the PS2, and the PSP. And that's a platformer, kind of a puzzle platformer based on the movie IP. I thought it was pretty solid. I was pretty proud of that. Then the next shipped game I had was Earth Defense Force Insect Armageddon, also with Vicious Cycle. Still, as I've probably mentioned before to you all, still one of my favorite games I've ever done. Really a blast. And then I worked on Ben 10 Galactic Racing, which is a kart racer. That was the last thing I did at Vicious before I moved on to Human Head. Of course, worked on Prey 2, which was canceled, and that whole sad story. Awesome game, though, that you'll never get to see. But then that's how I ended up, it's sometimes in your career, really negative things have really happy endings. So the thing that, happened after the whole Prey 2 debacle is we had to get additional work. And what work did we find? Well, that was BioShock Infinite, and that was the co-development there, where I lived in Boston. I worked in those offices at Irrational. It wasn't like sometimes when you do a co-development thing like that, it's you're just kind of given crumbs to work on. They just kind of send you off stuff, and it's whatever. This wasn't really like that. I mean, we were basically indistinguishable from Irrational Games employees in every sense. I mean, I was living in Boston, working there in the studio. I would always bump into Ken Levine when we would go to the bathroom. Like, he would be leaving the bathroom, and I'd be entering, and it would just be like, I would just have to dodge him, right? That was just kind of a funny thing. And the thing about Ken is that he just worked in a cubicle with everyone else. He was not in an office. Like, he was just there on the floor. So just, imagine that. You're working on this massive game, and there's this very famous, very well-known games industry figure that's just right there on the floor, working away, at a desk, really egalitarian in that sense. Then after that, worked on the Batman game for Warner Brothers. Again, that was another subcontract thing there. When I was working for Human Head Studios, we got that project. And that was fun because I love those Batman games a lot. And the one anecdote I always like to tell about that is there was a bug that I fixed on that game that was only fixed on the Wii U version, because that was what we were doing. Human Head was assigned the Wii U port of that game, Batman Arkham Origins. Okay. So and so that one question I always get is, when you're working on a port as a level designer, what kind of work do you do? Because someone else has done the level design, right? And the first answer is there usually isn't a lot of work for a level designer. It was really just because I was there on the team and they had to find a use for me, right? But there are bugs. There are bugs that have to do with the level scripting, the level design, that the programmers actually can't fix because they're not familiar with the level design tool set, and so that's where your value comes into play. There is you can go in and fix these things. And there was a bug where you go into the Batcave, and not to spoil the game, it's an old game now, but I won't spoil it. There's a change that happens to the Batcave in the game. And with that change, the collision changes in the Batcave. And if you're standing in the right place at the right time when that change happens, you can get stuck and you can't progress, and you have to reload a checkpoint, right? Now, I sat down, and because of my knowledge of Unreal, and this was Unreal 3, not 4 at that time, I was able to figure out what happened, and it was relatively simple to fix, but it was obscure. I mean, you had to know really well how Unreal worked with the way it streams levels in and out and stuff to be able to spot this thing. Like a programmer that's just spending all their time in Visual Studio, they wouldn't necessarily see this. I fixed this bug, and I submitted it to the server at the same time Warner Brothers Montreal announced that this would be a do not fix bug, a DNF, which basically just means the bug isn't worth fixing, it doesn't affect enough players, it's almost never going to happen, so don't waste resources on it, right? So because of that, I know that the Wii U version was the only version in which that bug got fixed, right? So that's pretty cool. That's kind of a nifty thing where I can say, yeah, that version is slightly, in some tiny imperceptible way, better because of something I did, however, minor or trivial, right? So, and then we did, kind of a slew of tiny projects at Human Head there before the end. I worked on a tech demo for Epic Games. They hired us to do a tech demo for Samsung phones, and that was one where I did all the music and sound for that, and they recorded my music with a symphony orchestra in Budapest, which I thought was pretty cool. I thought that was pretty awesome. And then I did some scripting and some audio work on a game called Crossy Kingdom. It was basically in fact, I think you can still find it now on iOS. It's free to play. It's a Crossy Road clone done kind of in a medieval dungeon style kind of thing. And that was, I think, the very last thing. Oh, right, I did a game where it was for casinos. It's strange. I'm not even sure Human Head put their logo on this necessarily, but it's out there, so it's not like secret or anything. You can even look it up. What was the name of that? It was the very last thing I worked on at Human Head before I left for Cold Iron. It's basically a first-person shooter that was a gambling machine, right? So you would, play this game at a casino, and I think it was like, you would make a bet, and if you shot enough enemies and avoided getting shot, the bet would pay out, right? Something like that. I'm not going to remember. I'm not going to remember the name of this thing. But what was kind of funny about that is when you work on, and it's the first and possibly only time in my life I'll work on a gambling thing, like real gambling, not even like loot boxes, but actual gambling, is when you make a gambling device, you get the gaming commission rules from like Nevada, places like that, and it's just a thick tome of rules that these things have to follow. It is regulated to the hilt. And what's odd is that it cannot be, what I remember from that is it can't be skill-based. It has to be random. It has to be based on random chance. And so you have to design this game where you make the player think they're being skilled, right? But it's really just random chance, right? Because that's what gambling is, and that's what it has to be, with the gaming commission rules. So that's, again, we helped with that, so I'm not exactly sure how all those systems were implemented by the other company that we were working on it with, but maybe Danger Arena, might be called Danger Arena, now that I think about it. But that was the very last thing I did. And so then I'm trying to remember if I'm forgetting any Cold Iron or any Human Head games. I talked about BioShock, Batman, and then the mobile games and the in the gambling games. So now we go to Cold Iron, and it's still the Aliens game they're working on still to this day. I worked on essentially that the whole time. Now it wasn't in the early days of the company, it wasn't an Aliens game. That happened when Fox bought us. So that's kind of where I am. The beginning of my career, it felt like I was basically shipping a game a year, for the first 4 or 5 years. I mean, it was pretty awesome, and then it got a little bit more typical in the back half of the 10 years where, the releases weren't coming as quickly because game development takes a long time. All right, so next question. Hopefully someone has thought of one now because I've given epically long answers to these things. If not, I will launch into some random anecdote. Anyone got another question for me? Ask me anything at all. It could be something as ludicrous as, do they keep soda at work? What's the environment like at a studio? Do they give you... Yeah, Keith.
What was your favorite platform to develop for? Like which console or mobile, I guess. But
Sure, yeah. So, again, the question is, what's my favorite platform to develop for? That's tricky to answer because when you're working on the game, it's always on a PC, right? And so it's like it doesn't feel like it. Now, you do have to, there's all kinds of things you have to keep in mind depending on what platform it is and kind of what the various restrictions are. But at least when you're doing the grunt work, it's kind of, you're just making it on PC. And, the extent of your platform thinking is really you're thinking about, am I using a controller or a keyboard and mouse, right? So when you're doing a game like a BioShock or a Batman Arkham Origins, you're going to be play testing your stuff with a controller as much as possible, even though mouse and keyboard was supported, in BioShock for PC use. I mean, most people play with a gamepad on console, so that is what you're going to be using most of the time. So that, I guess, comes into play. But I'll say, though, to directly answer your question, of course, being a fan of Nintendo, I always liked when I knew my work was going to be on one of their platforms, right? Like, thinking back, it was fun making a game for the Wii. I can't say Despicable Me, the game, used a lot of Wii-centric motion control stuff. In fact, I really don't think it did hardly at all, if I remember. But it was still cool to be on there. Obviously developing Arkham Origins for the Wii U was cool, even though, by that time, it was known that the Wii U was, not going to be Nintendo's most successful platform. I mean, that was pretty apparent. But, I just grew up with Nintendo, like those platforms. I know that what I'll say is that it is true that in the early days of my career, the PS3 was the hardest thing to deploy to. That was always the trickiest when you're trying to package your build, just like I have you do when you package builds. You have to, package the build of your game and then get it to run on a console test kit. And the PS3 was always the hardest to do that with. So I do remember headaches with that. But most engineers will say, what most of the good ones will say, right, is this. They'll say, at the end of the day, they're all the same. At the end of the day, they're computers, and we got to figure them out. Like, the good engineers have a very sort of blasé, kind of neutral attitude towards that. They're like, we just do what we can to get them, onto whatever machine we have to get them on, But that's an interesting question. All right, any other questions? Yeah.
Have you ever gotten to, work with VR?
That's a good question. So thanks, Jackson. So the question was, have I ever worked with VR? We did a lot of VR experimentation at Human Head in the last year I was there. Basically, what I recall was that when you work for a company like this, a work-for-hire company that's getting a lot of contracts, there's going to be gaps in time between the contracts, and when those gaps of time are happening, you work on developmental things, right? You work on pitches and prototypes and stuff. And so I think for the last year at Human Head, whenever we weren't on a contract, we would go back into the VR stuff we were doing because there was a a general call from Sony at that time because they were rolling out their VR solution. They were basically going to all the developers saying, "Hey, show us your VR prototypes, for potential funding." So we're like, "Okay, great. If there's any a moment of time when we're not getting paid to do something, we might as well spend that time doing a VR prototype for Sony." Right, and so that's what we did. And I remember we developed this thing. We used Oculus equipment, for this, to develop this on in Unreal 4. Actually, it was the first, my first exposure to Unreal 4 was working on this VR stuff. And so, anyway, it was basically a game that I think the concept of it was like you're in the Millennium Falcon, and imagine if it's like you and your friends on the Millennium Falcon, and each member of your team kind of has a role. Like, okay, you're the engineer, you're the person that's, adjusting the energy to the weapon systems, you're the person that's actually piloting the ship, right? And you had to kind of work together to take out this. It was like you were a mercenary, and all of a sudden a big warship that you didn't expect showed up, and you had to work together to take this warship down and steal something from it or whatever. It's like you're a cool Han Solo mercenary thing. And when we started developing it, we learned a lot of lessons about VR. It started out that, this kind of Millennium Falcon-esque ship, where it's, don't take that too literally. It's basically the size of the ship, really, where it's like, almost, or maybe like a Firefly. That might be a better, more apt comparison, where it's not a big capital ship, but it's big enough to have, multiple people on it, a crew. We had to able to freely navigate the ship. Well, that was Puke City, right? Being able to walk around, go up and down ladders and stuff. And so through the iterative process, we got this demo to really where you were just in the bridge. It was just you in your fixed position in the bridge, because we are already, having to deal with the fact that you're piloting this ship, so you're making the ship move through this environment, right? So anyway, it was basically I think 3 or 4 people in the ship, and you would be kind of going on this very simple mercenary mission, and then, oh no, this warship shows up, and you have to blow guns off of it and shoot down its shield generator, and it just, each thing takes a certain amount of teamwork. Like your weapon system person might say, okay, I need to get more energy into the lasers so I can shoot this thing, and then that slows you down. And so it was supposed to be like a teamwork thing, and it was fun because it was a total, what we would call in the industry, a total skunkworks project. And what do I mean by that? It actually is not dissimilar to what you all would do here at Purdue. There's no money behind this. This is just what we're doing. Other than the salaries we're getting paid, there's no money. So we're just grabbing stuff off the asset store. Because also we don't even have artists on the team. It's just like me and a few other level scripters and maybe a programmer or two or something. So we're just grabbing assets from the Unreal store, cobbling it together, mashing things together, kit bashing, all the stuff that you would do here, in a school program, because you don't have all these resources. It was the same kind of thing. And we, got a decent looking kind of Star Destroyer looking capital ship. And I remember prototyping up a turret that, for my scripting class people, used dot products to determine whether you were above and below it, just as an aside. And, we got all these things working. And what we ended up doing is then the demo that we recorded for this to show people, it's hard to demo VR. So what you do is we just set up a room, and with all the participants in the room doing all their things, and we just video recorded it. So you can see all the people sitting there doing all the things, and we combined it with game footage and kind of made a demo that kind of showed how it would work. And I left the company before the fruits of that labor, I think, were really fully exploited. I don't think Human Head ever got a big game out of it, but I think they did get some cool little serious games projects. I think they might have done something for a museum, a little VR project for them. So I do think it eventually did pay off all of that. Now, for me personally, what I learned from this is that VR makes me sick. I know that Professor Woodinghill has done some really good research work here on ways to reduce virtual reality sickness, but during the development of this, because this was months at a time working on this thing, I had to keep a Dramamine bottle on my desk at all times. And it didn't matter if it was smooth, because obviously frame rate is hugely impactful on whether or not people get sick. Doesn't matter. If we had that thing running at 60 frames per second, I was still getting sick. I must be susceptible to it. So I was kind of miserable, actually, for a lot of that. That soured me a bit on VR a little, because I was just sick all the darn time. And I prefer AR a little bit to VR for that reason, right? AR stuff, where you're projecting images on a desk or something, that doesn't make me sick. So that's kind of, the direction I prefer. But that's a cool question. Thank you. Okay, so let's see where we're at time-wise. We have about 13 minutes or so in this session. So anyone else got another question? Yeah, Jackson.
What made you want to go from like a big gaming company to being a professor at Purdue?
Yeah, so what made me want to be a professor at Purdue versus working in the industry? That's a good question to ask, because, of course, I didn't hate what I was doing. I loved what I was doing. So why would you stop doing something you love and go do something that is related but not exactly the same, right? Because obviously, if I had left from Cold Iron to simply be a level designer somewhere else, yes, every company has a different culture, all that, blah, 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 but it is still the same work, right? And so I would go into that being like super confident that I'd be happy doing it, right? Whereas when I went here, I was actually quite terrified. I was like, did I make the right decision? Oh my gosh, right? So why did I do that given that level of uncertainty? Well, it's a variety of reasons. You never make a career decision on one primary thing. But the most important reasons are, one, geography matters a lot. Now, it's interesting with the pandemic and more remote work, this matters maybe less than it did. But back then, in 2019, gosh, which is not that long ago, feels like a million years ago to say 2019 now. The reality was back then there was just no notion of being a game designer of any sort and working remotely. I'm sure it existed somewhere, but it was just not done. The thinking is, well, design, you have to be in a physical space and talking to those people. And so I knew in my career I'd be limited to California, Washington State, Texas. My family lives in Ohio and in Michigan, okay? And, when I was starting my career, I'm just going to be honest, I didn't care about that. Sorry, family, if you're listening. I just wanted to do what I love to do. And, my family, my immediate family, wife, I had actually already, my first daughter was around when I started. They were totally behind me, and we were willing to have the adventure. And we are kind of an adventurous family. I mean, we've gone to Europe, we've gone to Japan. We're very adventurous people in my family. But after a while, as you get older, the priorities do change a little bit, and you start thinking of like, well, gosh, my daughters have been in, 5 different schools in 5 years or whatever. I don't think it was quite that bad, but, bad enough, right? Changing schools a lot and changing homes a lot, and, there is a fatigue to that, right? So, I always knew that academia, which is why I got a master's degree, so I always had it in the back of my mind that academia could be a way to expand my options, right? Because yes, there's like, in Indiana, for instance, there's like one well-known established game developer, Relogic, that does Terraria, right? That's it. In Ohio, I think it's zero, actually zero, in terms of like, I'm sure there are some game developers that do things, but like in terms of like someone that famous enough where me, an industry expert, to know who they are, zero. Michigan has, they have Stardock. That's it, right? So if I was ever going to be able to do things like take a weekend visit to my folks and have it be 3 hours and not like a plane flight, I was going to have to broaden my horizons a bit. And so I always knew academia. So that was in the back of my head from the start. Now, what I thought I would do, and this is just how life will always go, right? Life is always like this. I thought, I'll make games for 15 years or so, and then I'll think about transitioning to academia. Well, I made games for 10 years and transitioned to academia. Why? It's only because when the Purdue opportunity came up, it was too good to ignore. You have to understand that opportunities happen when they happen, And one of the things I was telling myself is I didn't want to teach. I did some part-time teaching for a for-profit school, and that was fine. But that's, to do that as a full-time, I needed the prestige of a significant, good state university, that has a great reputation and I can feel proud to work for. And there's only so many of those, right? You're talking about Ohio State, Michigan State, Indiana, Notre Dame, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of these schools have well-established game dev programs. Those professors aren't going anywhere. So when I saw the Purdue thing, I'm like, well, it may be 10 years before I find another opportunity like this. As far, who knows when that'll show up again. I have to at least try. And, you try without even the expectation that it'll work out. I mean, it's Purdue. I mean, I remember I had no expectations it would work out, too. That's the other thing. But it did, and here I am, and I am glad to be here. What I tell people all the time is that, as a professor of practice, my main job is to teach you, is to be around you, the students. And that is my main focus as a professor of practice, as opposed to a tenure-track professor where the focus is research and such. And it's a really good thing I'm a professor of practice, because that is by far the best part of the job. Being here right now is great. All the classes I teach are great. I really love them. I love the grading, even though it can be quite exhausting. I do like it, looking at everyone's projects, trying to give good feedback. Advising senior capstones is a lot of fun. Helping out the clubs. Like, basically anything where I am interacting with you, the students, has been just a joy for me to do. It's been really awesome. The only parts, and every job has this, the game industry has this, you're never going to have a job that's perfect. Really with this job, it's everything else, which fortunately makes up a small percentage of everything else, right? Not all of it. Faculty meetings can be cool, right? But there is a lot of kind of administrative stuff that you have to do in this job, and that's not always, happy fun times. So I'm happy with the decision. I mean, I'm spending a lot of time in the game engine still, preparing lessons, even helping my capstone teams out. I don't really feel like my skills are getting dull at all. I feel like I'm still doing all the things I would normally be doing, just for different reasons. So it's been, I think, a satisfactory change. But who knows? I never like to think more than 6 months ahead. It doesn't mean, I bought a house here. I built it even, right? So obviously, I'm not expecting to go anywhere. But I never, my parents will always say, because they're being hopeful, right? Like, this is it, right? This is your forever thing. And what I'll always say to that is I'll say, so far, so good. Because life isn't like this. Life can change. And if 2020 has been the year that has proven that, right? How quickly and dramatically life can change. So I never like to think too far ahead. That doesn't mean I have a 401k, right? I built a house. I make long-term decisions, but I try not to emotionally commit myself to this idea that I'm going to be in one place for 30 years, even though that well may happen. It's just, I don't like to do that because life doesn't work that way. It just does not for most of us. Okay, how about this? It's 2:15. How about we have one more question? Because actually my voice will probably die at some point if I go on longer than an hour. So do we have one more question for this Ask Me Anything session? Any question at all. It could even be silly as long as it's about the game industry and about games. It doesn't have to be a super duper serious question. Like, seriously, ask me something about the break room. Ask me about fringe benefits that you might get. Ask me about, yeah.
What's the biggest office LAN party you ever had?
Biggest office LAN party. Is that the question?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So let me think about this. Every company has a different means of doing what you described, right? Although I got to say, I don't remember that happening at Vicious Cycle very much. Vicious Cycle was a very professional place. People just kind of showed up, did their stuff, and went home, right? It had a very, it's not to say it didn't have its own esprit de corps, but that's what I observed. People just went in there, did their stuff, were cool with it, whatever. At Human Head, there used to be all the time LAN parties for Rune, their original Viking game, which still kind of has a following now, and they would still constantly play it, right? All the time, because it was a game made in Unreal 2, and it was very fast action and very unique. Because it was done like a first-person shooter, even though it's a third-person game, but it was done kind of like a deathmatch game, but it's melee. It's all melee, right? It's swords, axes, it's Viking combat. So it's very, very unique and very different from most other games. So they would still constantly be playing it, throughout the whole studio. And thinking ahead to Cold Iron would always do a occasional sort of game jam, not game jam, because that's making a game, but I guess a thing where they would we would pick a game and all kind of play it together. I remember I brought in Broforce once for that, and that was a lot of fun. My most pleasant memory, though, of this wasn't necessarily the LAN party as much as it was Human Head used to do a thing where when a big game would come out, one of the studio heads would buy it, and it'd take it. Human Head had a really nice, and they still have it, I'm sure, a really nice theater room with tiered theater seating and a nice big projector and all that. So they would invite everyone into the theater room. It could probably hold about 20, 25 people. So not the whole studio, but not everyone would show up for these. They would invite everyone into the theater room to basically get a demo of the latest game, right? And those were a lot of fun because it was almost like a Mystery Science Theater environment, right? Everyone would be making comments. I remember the one for Aliens Colonial Marines was particularly funny because, of course, that game is legendarily bad, and they fired that thing up, to show it off, and just the various weirdnesses of that game just drew a lot of laughter, And then I do remember starting... that eventually morphed into we started showing B movies in there. People would bring pizza and beer on Friday, and we'd bring in crappy movies. So it morphed into this thing where people would bring in weird or bad games or weird or bad movies, and we'd kind of get together and hang out. And then that eventually led to my favorite thing at Human Head, which was there was a really nice cigar bar across the street. And that ended up being where whenever you'd have a work anniversary, you'd go there, and when you leave the company and it's your kind of going away thing, you go there. And I'll just say, one really nice thing about Human Head, and then those folks will always be my dear friends, sometimes companies act a little weird when you leave, it's a betrayal. It must be because you hate us, right? And they can get a little weird. The guys at Human Head aren't like that at all. They wish you well, and that's how it should be because it's almost never personal. It's your situation changes, right? I just remember having a really touching, fun, going away thing at the cigar bar. I remember one of the owners bought me one of their expensive ones. There, probably the last time I actually ever smoked cigars. I don't think I've smoked cigars since then. But yeah, I talk about Human Head a lot very fondly because I spent more time there than the other companies I've worked for and probably had the most fun there, I would say, overall. Even though I haven't worked for any place that was bad. I enjoyed my whole career, but the Human Head guys were special. All right, that will do it. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording. Thank you for asking good questions and participating. Hopefully you got something out of it.